You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
My writing process is, when I write a story, I start by building what I call a development document, or I should say this century anyway. In past centuries, or in the 20th century, I had a different process. In the 21st century, I started doing work as a web developer. And when I worked as a web developer, you always do develop way back in the early part of the century, you always did development documents for a website to basically delineate everything you were going to be doing, everything that you needed to make the website work. And I realized that was a really handy approach to writing. So I began making development documents for any time I took on a longer form project. And I would start by writing down a cast of characters, then doing a synopsis of the plot. And with the cast of characters, I would divide them into major and minor. Minor characters, I just needed to include, quirks that would play out in the story. And of course, for the major characters, I wrote extensive biographies because I wanted to understand them. My feeling has always been that if you treat your fictional characters as real people, they behave more naturally when you write about them. Now, other people might have it. I have, structuralists and utilitarians always lecture me and they say, what's the purpose of such a character? It's like, well, the purpose of him is he exists and he's part of the story. I'm an organic writer. I'm not structuralist. I don't create characters for specific roles. I just, and this results in, some characters that I view as minor when I write them out suddenly becoming major characters. And I have to go back in the second draft and kind of fix it, because you can't have a major character suddenly pop up halfway through a book. That's kind of jarring to a reader and annoys them. So, and the last part of the development document is I would write the first chapter of the story, and then I would write the last chapter. The last chapter usually ends up getting trashed, but the last chapter's only purpose is to kind of give me a compass to sail towards, because I then take the first chapter and then I just begin telling the story. I never outline stories. And people usually stare at me like I have three heads when I say that. It's like, no, never outline a story, because when I outline a story, I spend too much time trying to force the writing to meet the outline, which is the opposite, I think, of good storytelling. Other people might do it. I can't.
Yeah, it's too rigid.
Yeah. And by the time I get to the end of the story, the end has usually changed. But the original ending does kind of give me a guidepost, something to aim towards. And if I don't quite hit it, I'm fine with that. So, and that's, essentially what happened here is I had a beginning and I had an end. The problem was that there was too much story to tell. And so I had to chop off a large chunk of it and then write a brand new ending. And the rest of it, I eventually got around during the COVID lockdowns. That's when I wrote the original third draft of this book and the first draft of the second one, which is called The Man Who Was Sherlock. And yes, I did deliberately choose both titles from late Victorian horror stories. Well, I guess technically The Man Who Was Thursday is an Edwardian horror story. People view it as a spy story, but Chesterton makes very clear what he's doing with it, because the full title of the book is The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. And it's sort of horror story. And that's a deliberate choice, because when I was creating the story for NaNoWriMo several years ago, I was, and this is where I get into the long version of the story. It was adapted from something I wrote, when I was in my 20s. When I was a young kid, I was a huge fan of Rex Stout. We used to have this giant library in my house, or not a giant library, but in our basement, we had this giant wall that was from floor to ceiling bookshelves. And there were hundreds of books on it, and including a bunch of Rex Stout. So I got into the habit of reading here. And my mother was a big mystery fan when I was a kid. A lot of hard-boiled stuff, like the Parker novels and the Dick Kearney Detective Agency novels. There was a lot of Hugh Pentecost, a lot of Leslie Egan, who's one of the original police procedural writers. And there was also a lot of Rex Stout down there, as well as the other part of this was she had this giant, the full 2-volume Baring's Gold annotated Sherlock Holmes, which was the original attempt to put the Sherlock Holmes stories in chronological order. rather than in the publication order. So, of course, from the time I was a young child, I began reading the Barings Gold edition of Sherlock Holmes and Rex Stout. And Rex Stout is kind of the bridge between the golden age of detective fiction, and the silver age of detective fiction. The golden age, these are the puzzle writers. Agatha Christie, of course, is the most famous. But Edgar Allan Poe, kind of invented that sort of story. Arthur Conan Doyle revolutionized it. The queens of the genre would be I guess, one is New Zealand, and Guy Marsh, and I don't even know if I'm saying her name correctly, the Inspector Allen mysteries, and Dorothy Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey. But they all had this one thing in common. They were kind of cozy English detectives who were focused on solving puzzles. Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple. And Dashiell Hammett sort of changes all that with his confidential op stories. That kicks in the Silver Age. It's no longer about the puzzle. It's more about the detective solving the puzzle.
Right.
And Rex Stout was kind of the bridge between them, because if you look at the Nero Wolfe stories, there's Nero Wolfe, and he's even though the stories are set in New York, he's clearly an old-fashioned, cozy English detective, although Montenegrin, but still he has that archetype. But his assistant isn't, Dr. Watson. It's Archie Goodwin, a gumshoe, and he is clearly something right out of Hammett. So that was the kind of space that he occupied. He was a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. And so there, I don't know, my mother had maybe a dozen of those Rex Stout novels on her shelf, and I read all of them. When I got to college, I began haunting the used bookstores of Boston, and I bought a bunch more. And I can't tell you the names of the first two titles. I can only tell the name of the third. It was the day that I kind of outgrew Nero Wolfe. It was a book called Some Buried Caesar. And it was the third time that I had encountered the exact same ending in a Nero Wolfe novel. And it was when I encountered that ending for the third time, I finally realized there actually was no Nero Wolfe. It was just Archie. And he'd encountered a case that was too difficult for him to solve. And he imposed his will on the case, and everyone just stopped asking questions, because the way the book ended was that they get a confession from the killer, and the killer writes it all out for them nicely in a note, complete with a suicide note, and proceeds to kill himself. And I remember reading that.
In 3 books.
It was 3 times. It was the third time. I don't know how many others he ever used, because he wrote a lot of books. I don't know how many times he used that ending, but that was the third time that I'd encountered it. And I could never take it. At that point, I could never take it seriously again, because I knew the secret.
Right.
There was no Nero Wolfe. Archie was the detective. And on these 3 cases, they were just too tough for him to solve. And so he just picked the most likely suspect, beat a confession out of them, staged a suicide, and everyone said, okay, time to go home. And that was it. And so I set about writing that story when I was in my early 20s. And I called it The Suicide Tree. And the idea was that there's a murder staged to look like a suicide, a person hanging himself in a tree. And the ending, of course, is Archie not being able to figure out who the actual killer is, and then picking the most likely suspect and beating the confession out of them and staging the suicide in the suicide tree. And everyone goes home because, we have a suicide note. What more do we need? However, when I finished it, I was, 23 or 24 at the time. Within months of my finishing the first draft of this, and back in those days, I used to use those neat composition notebooks. You have to remember them, the black and white ones that had like 120
I do,
yeah. Anyway, within a few months of that, Michael Caine, Ben Kingsley movie came out without a clue. And the trailer made me suspicious. But on the other hand, Michael Caine and Ben Kingsley were 2 of my favorite actors. And it was Sherlock Holmes. And I thought, how bad could it possibly be? Well, it was truly, truly terrible. I could not recommend to anybody to see the movie, especially if you're a fan of Michael Caine or Ben Kingsley, because they are clearly embarrassed to be in the movie, and it shows. They obviously were both in need of money at the time, and there must have been a large paycheck attached. And of course, what annoyed me was that, my idea, of course, was a role reversal, that Archie Goodwin hires an actor to play the role of Nero Wolfe because Archie understands that he's not impressive enough. And the actor basically recites the chains of logic that he feeds to him. And but Nero, the actor that plays Nero Wolfe, abuses Archie's trust because if you read the books, what Nero spends a lot of time doing is, drinking beer, buying expensive books, and buying expensive meals and having a cook. And so, he abuses Archie in this fashion. And that's how mine took off. And this is what they did the same thing here. And it annoyed me because, of course, if you read Sherlock Holmes stories, Watson is not a bumbling oaf. So there is no role reversal to be done. That image kind of comes to us from the Basil Rathbone movies, and I forget the name of the actor that played Watson in them. He's completely wrong for the role, but it's because he'd been playing Watson on stage for almost 20 years at the time. Mm-hmm. So he had aged out of the role. But the filmmakers decided that he was so familiar to English people as Watson that they might as well put him into the role. And so that's where you get the idea. And he always played Watson on stage as a bumbling oaf, I guess. And that's how we get the idea that Watson is a bumbling oaf. But he's not. He's a very intelligent, hardworking man, and he's the key participant. As much as I dislike the Robert Downey Jr. movies, their version of Watson is a lot closer to the truth than how he normally gets portrayed. Mm-hmm. But what Without a Clue really did was it just caused me to take my Nero Wolfe thing and throw it in my writing box and say, okay, that idea has been spoiled now for ever and a day, because everyone will think that I'm just spinning off of what I saw on the screen. And I like to think, although I can't actually check this, because all my work before the age of 35, with a couple of weird exceptions, was destroyed in a flood. So I can't actually go back and look at it anymore. Basically, what survives of my pre-age of 35 writing are two notebooks. When I was at Emerson College, one of my instructors was Dennis Leary, and he always used to tell us to carry around one of those little hand notebooks with you, because he said in the middle of every, we didn't have computers back in the early 80s. So it was our version was to write stuff down in these little notebooks. That way, if you had an idea, you could sketch it out, wherever you were, whether you're sitting on a train or in a restaurant, right, and you could go back and use it later. So two of those survived, because it just so happened that they were packed away someplace else and not in with the rest of the writing stuff. Yeah. Anyway, so I set aside the Nero Wolfe thing, and years later I thought about going back to it, but then I said, at this point nobody remembers who Nero Wolfe is. So in the 80s there was somebody. It wasn't Rex Stout. They were using the name, but there was still new Nero Wolfe stuff slipping out. And, the old books were still selling. But by, when I had thought about going back to it, which was the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, somewhere in there, Nero Wolfe had completely vanished from the public consciousness. So he was gone, and there was nothing to be done about it. And then I thought, well, maybe I could fix Without a Clue. Create a different mystery where Holmes is not the detective, but Watson is, and maybe I can do a better job. But really, what I found out when I got to the end of it was that the idea was just a terrible idea, and it's one of the few pieces of computer-aided writing that I ever did that I actually deleted. I usually save everything. One of my old editors used to jokingly refer to me as the most ecologically conscious writer alive, because I recycled everything. But then I used to say, well, John Buchan and Arthur Conan Doyle are my heroes, and they recycled everything too. So Doyle literally, because he literally tells the same story twice in the Sherlock Holmes canon. The Adventure of the Second Stain and the Adventure of the Naval Treaty are literally the same story. The first time is the Adventure of the Naval Treaty, and he wrote during the initial burst, which was 1891 to 1893. And the Adventure of the Second Stain comes when he revived the character in the early 1900s. And it's almost like he had, hey, what if there's a valuable document that got stolen from the, from the foreign ministry, and possession of this document could lead to a war that would burn Europe to the ground. And it's actually taken by a relative of the victim. And that's a great idea. He just not realizing that he had the same idea a decade before and written the same story a decade before. Circumstances are different, but all the plot points are the same. But I like both stories, so I can't complain too much. Anyway, But I deleted the first Sherlock Holmes thing because it was just truly terrible and it was just a bad idea. And I went back to writing short stories because that's what I love doing. And then, like I said, I had an Indonesian friend, Lisna, who bugged me into writing a story for NaNoWriMo. And I tried to think of something, and I finally decided to go back to the Nero Wolfe story idea, but to apply it to Holmes and Watson. But this time I was going to play the Sherlock game when I did it and create something really different. The Sherlock game was Dorothy Sayers' invention, of course, because there are a lot of inconsistencies in the Holmes stories. Doyle recycled everything. He never wrote a timeline for himself. And you can tell this because there are two stories which he literally sets during the time when Sherlock Holmes is in hiding. The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge is set in 1892, and the Adventure of the Three Gables is set in 1893. Now Bering's Gold and others tried to sure, he says it's set in 1893, but it's really not. But no, I take Watson at his word. Those stories really happened. And so, how does it happen? Well, what it boiled down to for me is that it's when you look at the stories, if we play the Sherlock game, we have to accept when Watson is the narrator, Watson is the writer. When Sherlock is the narrator, Sherlock is the writer. Mm-hmm. And on the couple of occasions when it's when he's using a third person objective, or actually third person limited viewpoint, that Watson is just the writer, but taking himself out of the role of first person narrator. So what I come down to is that Watson is a liar. Because there are just a lot of things that he says in the stories that if A is true, B cannot be. If B is true, A cannot be. Mm-hmm. And especially we get to the fact that there are two stories which he delineates as Sherlock Holmes adventures, which clearly can't be because Sherlock is nowhere near London at the time. Mm-hmm. And amusingly, if you read the stories, Sherlock does not behave in a very Sherlockian fashion in those two stories. Mm-hmm. If you read The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge, the primary detective is actually the county detective, Inspector Baines. Sherlock and Watson kind of hover around the perimeter of the story. And if you go to the Three Gables, the Douglas Maybury murder, Sherlock's behavior is so eccentric and so weird that there's a considerable debate about whether or not that story was written by Arthur Conan Doyle or his son Adrian, because it was near the end of Doyle's life, at a point in time where his son actually took over writing the Sherlock stories in the 30s, that it could have been Adrian Conan Doyle, but more likely it was just Arthur Conan Doyle at the end of his life when he was having problems concentrating. But again, Sherlock doesn't behave in a very Sherlockian fashion. And coincidentally, in 1892, Sherlock is somewhere maybe in Tibet or maybe the Middle East, according to the timeline he gives in The Adventure of the Empty House. So I was basically playing the Sherlock game with this. And I was also attempting to do it. I didn't want to do a reversal because that's it doesn't work with Watson, because I think Watson is a fascinating narrator. So what I tried to do at the surface level was to tell the story of two men that have created a myth that ultimately overcomes them. That the myth of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson begins to loom large over the British public, and especially after, of course, Watson writes the stories, the first burst of stories between 1891 and 1893. The character just becomes so huge in the British imagination that the real people that are involved can't possibly ever live up to these to the roles they've given themselves.
Right.
And there are other things, of course. There's also subtext in the stories, because my favorite writers are Gene Wolfe and Peter Ackroyd. So I always write on several levels, so that no matter how many times you peel the onion, there's still something there for you to see. But when I do it, I always make it a point to make certain that you don't have to peel the onion. I want to make certain that if you do nothing more than read the surface level of the story, that it's enough for you.
Yeah.
So that you feel, I don't want people to feel like they're missing something. If they want to dig deeper, there's stuff to dig into.
Yeah.
But if they don't ever want to dig deeper, the story is complete for them. So at the heart of it, I think it's about two men that have basically, Watson, of course, creates the myth. But ultimately, the man that takes on the role of Sherlock Holmes agrees to become part of it. And he finds, as you can see in the book, that he does not actually like the role. And part of the first book, of course, is his desperation to escape being Sherlock Holmes. And that's where the whole thing runs, is his attempts to escape being Sherlock Holmes ultimately, and of course the things that happen along the way. Because one of the on the Sherlock Holmes timeline, one of the late stories, the ones that Doyle wrote when he brought the character back to life, the two best of them are probably Wisteria Lodge and also The Valley of Fear, which amusingly came from Arthur Conan Doyle being on the same cruise with the man that was heading up the Pinkertons at the time. And the man that was heading up the Pinkertons, to impress Arthur Conan Doyle, told them the story of how one of their detectives had broken the Pennsylvania coal mining gang, the Molly Maguires. And he got upset when Arthur Conan Doyle basically turned that story into The Valley of Fear. And I always thought, it's like, what did you think was going to happen when you tell the world's leading detective writer a detective story, and it's an interesting one? How could you not expect it to end up, published everywhere? But anyway, but that is one of the two stories that mentions James Moriarty. But there's such a huge gap between the two stories, because the first Moriarty story, publication wise, is The Adventure of the Final Problem, which was written at the end of 1893. And it was a point where Doyle had just wanted to launch a writing career, but he envisioned himself as the writer of historical fiction, Tales of the White Company. And he just wanted to get rid of Holmes because he thought, well, I'm famous enough now that people will read anything that has my name on it, which didn't actually work out for him. But that's the first time where Moriarty is mentioned, but he doesn't have a name in the first story. He's just Professor Moriarty. His brother is Colonel James Moriarty in the first story. Then in the Valley of Fear, that was written, it's the pre-World War I era, but 1912, 1913, 1914. I couldn't tell you exactly when. But by now, of course, we're 20 years removed from, from the Final Problem. And he decided to introduce, Professor Moriarty as a character in the in the story. And when searching for a name for Professor Moriarty, he just settled on James. And so it's Professor James Moriarty in the second tale and Colonel James Moriarty, the brother, in the first tale. So you essentially have two brothers named James Moriarty. So this is one of the things that when you play the Sherlock game, you have to explain, well, why are there two James Moriartys? George Foreman was not alive in the mid 19th century. So, of course, my solution to it was that they're technically first cousins, but that when the younger one is orphaned at a young age, that he and his sister are adopted by their aunt and uncle. And so, therefore, they are technically brothers, but adopted brothers rather than actual brothers. Right. Again, that's just part of the Sherlock game. Dorothy Sayers tells us we can't play fast and loose, but we have to find explanations for all these inconsistencies in the stories. And there are a lot, again, because Doyle he didn't keep a timeline of his home stories, and he hated the character so much that he couldn't be bothered to remember, again, the fact that there are two stories set in the time when Sherlock Holmes is allegedly dead tells you that he hated the character so much that he didn't really even care enough to look this stuff up or remember it. And part of it is his own fault, because people always say, well, he killed him off. That was unpopular. It was, but that wasn't actually what started Sherlock Mania. I mean, the stories in the Strand were incredibly popular due to the illustrations, but what really started Sherlock Mania off onto its unbelievable heights was actually a novel that he wrote a short time after Sherlock was dead, The Hound of the Baskervilles. That that would have been like the equivalent of the Da Vinci Code in the 1890s. It just sold. They couldn't keep it on the bookshelves. It was selling so fast. Mm-hmm. And again, Doyle being the great recycler, he needed a detective for the story. And rather than creating a new detective, he said, well, the heck with it. I got Sherlock Holmes. I'm just going to use him, and I'll just set the story in 1886 it's 1887, I think, is when he set the story. I'll just set it in 1887, and that'll be that. And so he recycled Holmes. But that story, because it came after Sherlock's death, everyone went out and bought it. And it is really a great, great novel. And there's no two ways around that. Much like The Valley of Fear, there's no two ways around the fact that The Valley of Fear is a fantastic novel. Despite Doyle's well-known hatred of his own character. Anyway, so the Hound of the Baskervilles really basically made the pressure to bring Sherlock Holmes back to life unbearable for Doyle, because the flood of mail that came in after that was just, I guess, it made it so that even though we disliked the character, he had to bring him back. Mm-hmm. Plus, his career as a historical novelist had kind of fizzled. So,
well, apparently he wrote better detectives than
he did. And there's also there's non-Holmes detective fiction from Doyle as well, which is also really good. Like one of the things that I make reference to, and it's clearly a Watson and Moriarty story. It's the it's the mystery of the disappearing train. That's not what it's actually called. The problem of the vanishing train, or the problem of the vanishing special. Neither the detective nor the villain are named, and the detective only interacts with the Times letters page, and he writes in about the solution to the case. And the villain is a man of unprecedented evil genius. So it's clearly Watson writing the letters, and clearly Moriarty, who is the man behind it all. And but he never names them. And I did borrow liberally from Doyle's other detective fiction to add elements to the book. For example, one of the things there's a scene in the first book where Watson is sitting in a cafe in Antwerp because he's monitoring surveilling a tailor shop across the street, and he starts to write a play, and that play, he gives this idea: I'm going to write a play about a museum director who is breaking into his own museum to return gems that have been stolen, and that's actually one of his non-Holmes detective stories about a former director of a museum who realizes that his son-in-law has stolen a bunch of gems and doesn't want to see his son-in-law go to jail. So he steals them from his son-in-law and then breaks into his own museum to return them. It's a very funny story. And so I just sort of threw that in there. And I also borrowed some of those non-Sherlockian detective characters for parts of it. They got excised into the second book, The Man Who Was Sherlock. Like Lord Southron, who is a character from. I read. I used to know these more because I read the collection of his non-Holmesian fiction like 20 years ago. I can't remember the name of the story. It's about a man who inherits a title, and he is invited to a distant relative's house to celebrate. And the distant relative attempts to kill him by unleashing a tiger on him. And of course, what it turns out is that the distant relative didn't want to actually congratulate him. He wanted to kill him because he was next in line to be Lord Southron if this person died. But I borrowed Lord Southron for the second, or what's now the second story.
given what we've been talking about, what exactly are you working on now?
I have a second long form story that has to be rewritten. But as much as I like it, it's a really long story. It's 500 and something odd pages. So I really want to force myself to take up the Man Who is Sherlock to get that ready, because I'm hoping to develop enough of a sales presence that people will look at because again, a 500-page book is a long one. And I think it's 560 something pages long, and some of it will have to be cut. But again, as a storyteller, I like to tell slow stories. I feel that part of the enjoyment of a story is becoming immersed in the world. And I like to, and since I know that I enjoy that, I'd like to try and give that to my readers as well. So the song, the novel, it was another NaNoWriMo project, but the NaNoWriMo had changed their platform so that there was no way of submitting text, or I couldn't find one anyway. And apparently there was like a 2-hour window at the end of the month where you were supposed to submit the text, which I missed because I was out. I gave them my guidelines, and ultimately when I would look back at it again, they stopped. It's not really a promotion tool anymore. And, if you look at the website, they talk about, well, we're here to promote marginalized voices. And it's like, well, I think that all writers are marginalized. Let's be honest. We pursue a strange path. Anyway, but the story itself came from a running joke in an episode of Castle from its declining years. I think season 6, maybe. There's an episode where the murder mystery is the alleged murder of a novelist who is based on J.D. Schlesinger, who writes a seminal novel called The Butcherbird Song, and then goes into hiding. And then there's a running joke along the show about what the novel is about, and it's never about the same thing twice, which is the joke. And I thought, hey, that's a great title for a horror novel. Although the joke, of course, is if you actually see a butcher bird, they're not terribly frightening, despite the name. They're from Australia, and they're kind of, I jokingly refer to them as murder pigeons, which is what they are. They're little pigeon-sized birds, and they've got this really mean-looking beak, which they use for spearing worms. Just how they got the name, the butcher bird. Who is? Oh, you have a co-host?
No, I'm me. Here.
Okay. Somebody says WCAT co-host, WCAT radio co-host.
That's me. All right. I got a text. I got a text from Cynthia saying she lost you.
We just got back. We just got back a minute or two ago.
Yeah.
All right.
I had paused the recording when I saw that when I saw that she had frozen.
My house lost power.
Okay. I'll let it space out. So are you still the host?
Yes, I'm still the host. I can transfer that back to you if you'd like. If you just tell me how to do it.
No, don't do that. I'm going to disappear.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Have a great day.
All right.
Bye.
At least you're not decreasing.
Anyway, I thought it was a great title for a horror novel. And so I set out to write a story that was actually, originally I was supposed to be a murder mystery because I like writing mysteries, but it kind of grew into a horror novel, especially, because of what I was picturing. The title is kind of self-referential in the book because it's about a series of killings that take place as the series of killings do in a novel called The Butcherbird Song. And the first victim is the alleged author of it, although, as it turns out, he's not the author of the story. And as the story goes on, because of the nature of the killings, it involves the murder victims are killed with a spear, and their right eyes are torn out by a butcher bird, in fact. It was just a bunch of stuff rambling inside of me that I just kind of threw together. And because it was a NaNoWriMo project. But I got to the end of NaNoWriMo and I realized that I had something that was, I had to trash it, other than the first and last chapter, of course. But I had something because the cast of characters worked really well. One of the characters that I had envisioned as a minor character when I started it kind of sort of grew out of control in the story. And I realized I had to really go back and restructure the thing because he needed a more prominent role. My brother was cast, well, is he a narrative character? It's like, now there are 4 narrative characters. He is not one of them. It's like, well, what's his purpose? I'm like, I don't care what his purpose is, that he exists in the story and his relationship with one of the 2 main characters is an extremely vital bedrock for that main character. It's like, he took that role onto himself in the telling of the story. I said, I'm an organic storyteller, not a structuralist. And he grew into this role, and that's just who he has to be. And I had to go back and rewrite it because he was not there. He's there in mention at the start, but he's not really there in person at the start. So he has to be there in person from the beginning. You can't introduce that person on page 200. If he's a major character, he kind of has to be there from early on in the book.
Right.
So these are the things that had to be fixed, and a bunch of this. So that one is actually going to end up taking 4 drafts because, technically speaking, my second draft was kind of the first draft because it was a massive, massive rewriting of what I had from NaNoWriMo. And there was just a lot of structural changes that I needed to make. And when I got to the end of it, it's like, okay, this needs another major rewrite because it's just a bunch of stuff that has to be cleaned up. And it now still needs one more version before it'll be ready for telling. And I tried to, and part of the challenge with this one is that there are so many layers of story in it. Because part of it, while it's on the surface about a shut-in character, or reclusive character, I guess, who writes and who early on in his life forms a partnership with one of his best friends from college, so that he doesn't have to make public appearances for his books. And his friend would assume the role of the author in public while he would write the books in private. And he would pay his friend for the money, or pay his friend for his work as the public face of the partnership. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point in the story, or at a certain point in their history, the lawyer who was in charge of all this basically swindles the writer out of his share of the money, or his share of the partnership, and he more or less moves on with his life and tries to write different types of stories in a different voice for reasons that are involved in the novel. And the whole series of murders, of course, is jarring to him because these are people that are, for him, the story that he tells is buried in his own family's history. His father is a good man, but his grandfather on his paternal side is a monster, and as it turns out, the grandfather's best friend is even worse. And in essence, he's not truly touched by this because his father, he's the product of his father's second marriage. And so he's not really related to the people involved, but that history sort of bleeds into his work. Mm-hmm. And part of what I do is I try to bury in the subtext to the stories about the family. The main character's name is Paul McCallum, and he's comes from a family of Scottish immigrants from the early 20th century. But part of what I try to bury into the subtext of the story is the history of of Andrew McCallum, which is his fraternal grandfather, and the Andrew McCallum's best friend, a man by the name of Miles Nienhuis, who's an old line New Yorker, dating back to the days when Manhattan was still New Amsterdam. And those stories are kind of buried in the subtext, as well as the story of the house that he lived in. He was supposed to live in based on a real Park Slope mansion, which is these days a school. I envisioned what would happen if this wasn't a school and it was still in use as a house. So he lives in a giant house that the history of the house, which is also not very innocent, is also buried in the subtext of the story. And I leave clues for people to read all this stuff, and if people really want to dig, they'll be able to read the history of characters that only appear in reference, namely Pete McCallum, who is dead when the story starts because, of course, he's supposed to have been born in the early 1920s and dies at the end of the 20th century. His sister, Frankie McCallum, who, again, born in the 1920s and dies in the early 21st century, because the story itself was set in 2019. So a lot of these people are just long dead. Miles Nienhuis, his daughter, Milena, and Andrew McCallum. All these people are long gone, but their stories are kind of buried in the subtext of the tale. And if you dig into it, you'll be able to reason it out. But then you don't need to, because the story itself tells you everything that you need to know on the surface level. This is just, I started reading Gene Wolfe when I was in high school. I first encountered one of his books in Analog magazine. Not books, stories. What was it called? How I Defeated Hitler and Won the Second World War, I think. It's basically a story about a English engineer who is evaluating at a World's Fair where Nazi Germany is introducing the Volkswagen and Imperial Japan is introducing the Toyota. He figures out the traffic patterns and bets Hitler that his car will beat the Volkswagen. And it's all about, basically, if you read it further, it's all about the orbits of electrons and atoms. But on the surface, it's a story of an engineer that figures out the traffic pattern. But of course, it's really about electrons and their motion. And after that, I just began reading anything Gene Wolfe. I think the second thing I encountered from him in college was his children's story, The Devil in the Forest. And then later on, the Latro tales, which were, to this day, are my favorite. Soldier in the Mist and Soldier of Arit. And then there's the third one that he wrote years and years later. I think as much to torment his publisher as anything else, because his publisher kept bugging him. The Latro stories don't truly end the story of Latro. As a character, he's somebody who was wounded in the Battle of Plataea. He's a Latin soldier wounded in the Battle of Plataea, and his comrades leave him behind with an Egyptian doctor who promises that he can heal Latro because he suffered a severe head wound. And the doctor is as good as his word and heals Latro. But the result of the head wound is that there are two things that become true. One, Latro can now see the gods, as in the Greek gods, and theoretically the others. And then the other thing, of course, is that he can't remember anything from day to day. Anything that happens to him on Monday, he will when he wakes up on, he has no more ability to form long-term memory. So whenever he wakes up on Tuesday morning, nothing from the day before will be in his memory. So the book is basically Latro writing down the things that have happened to him so that he can go back and refer to them. But of course, as a character, Latro can never really, when he starts his day up, he can't read his entire story. Well, at the beginning of the book, he can, but as the book progresses, he can't read his entire story every day. So he can only really read the last few chapters of his story. And Gene Wolfe does an unbelievable job of juggling this, so that there are things that the reader understands that the character does not. And he does the character never betrays knowledge that he shouldn't have. because again, if he's just reading the last 3 or 4 chapters of his life, he can't, remember something that happened 100 pages ago. And he never cheats like that. And I remember at the time being just impressed at the amount of work that it took to never make that mistake. But when the first 2 stories end, because the first 2 stories are supposed to take place consecutively, and they end at an Olympics, and it's when Latro's friends come to rescue him, or at least that's what you're guessing, because they take him and they vanish from the page. But what happened to him? Nobody knows. The last chapter is written by a Greek poet who is one of Latro's companions on his journeys through Greece, and he tells the story of how Latro was taken out of the Olympiad by what he thought were his friends, but Latro just sort of vanished at the end of the story. And the publisher, I guess, always bugged him about, well, what happened to Latro? There has to be so he wrote a 3rd book in the 21st century called Soldier of Sidon. And again, I know that his publisher bugged him for years to close the Latro loop. And so he wrote a story about how somebody goes to see Latro on his estates in Italy and promises him, hey, if you come on this journey with me down the Nile, there's somebody in Egypt that can heal you and give you your ability to have memories back again, so that you don't have to remind yourself every day that you're still married to your wife. And so he takes this final journey to go down the Nile to see, I forget who now, but of course, when the story ends, he never gets there, and his ship is crashed, and he's stranded in Lower Egypt in antiquity. Because of course, we're talking the Battle of Plataea is it is what, 476 BC, I think. Pre-Alexandrian. It's pre-Alexandrian. Yeah. It was during the days of Darius the Great, so it's pre-Alexandrian. So there was no Alexandria, Egypt at this time, and so he's stranded in the middle of Egypt, probably somewhere around 460 BC. And that's where the story ends, because he never got around to writing another Latro book. Again, he was also part of the 1920s. So by the 21st century, he was a little, he was winding down. And he was actually quite prolific right up until the end. But, still, he had a lot of different interests, and not everything could be about Latro. So Latro is the last anyone saw Latro was he was stranded in Egypt. And I always thought that was kind of appropriate, because Latro's story is such that you actually should never know the end of it, especially since part of the conceit is that his story is basically documents found in archaeological dig sites. The first book, Soldier Soldier in the Mist, is supposed to come from a pot that is found someplace in Greece, and then when he wrote the second book several years later, they found on a dig site near the first one, they found this other scroll, which appeared to be part of the same story. And so for the third one, it was from a scroll they found someplace in Egypt. And they were shocked to have found a third scroll about Latro, because they thought that he was lost to history. But again, because of the surface level conceit, Latro should stay lost like that. That's just how he had to end. Anyway, but that's where part of my theories on writing came from. Pardon me. I told this person not to text me for the next 2 hours, and they're not paying attention to me. So I'm going to shut my phone off right now.
Well, that happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
People don't listen.
Yeah. And so that's, anyway, Gene Wolfe was a large part how I formed my theories about writing. It was just about trying to tell a story that works on the surface, and that you don't need to look past that. But that when you start digging into it and start tearing away layers of it, there's always something left behind for you to dig into. So The Butcher Bird Song is not a large rewrite, but to convince anybody to publish it, aside from myself, I would need to have a sales record. So I really wanted to get the Holmes things, because I thought the Holmes things might generate enough sales that people might actually look at something else.
I understand. Yep. Publishing is not an easy thing. Being successful writing is not easy. You have to do it of it. So
yeah. Anyway, so I did launch the first book on Kindle Direct, and if I could get the Amazon template to work, it'll be on in the print on demand section as well. I'm going to do Kindle Select for 90 days, but it has to be exclusive for that. So for 90 days, it'll be exclusive to Amazon. After that, I can put it up on Barnes and Noble as well, and I will do that. So sometime in probably June, it'll go up on Barnes and Noble. But for right now, it's the Kindle version is available on Amazon, and theoretically, the print on demand for people that don't do ebooks will be available soon. Again, the Amazon template keeps giving me problems. I think they want you to use their artwork because they provided you with a template, and I been a production artist in the past as well. I do a lot of digital painting. So I used my own artwork. Well, actually, the front page design is something I used from an illustrator of mine that I work with on occasion. He drew the image of Holmes and Watson at Reichenbach Falls. The image on the back is my own. It's a digital painting of Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. And I tried, sizing the image to fit the white area inside the template, and I was told that wasn't correct. And I said, well, there are black lines in the middle of what I thought was the bleed area. Maybe they want me to size to that. So I sized to the black lines in the bleed area, and they said, well, no, that's not, you haven't sized the images correctly. And I'm thinking to myself, where else do I put them? And I tried sizing them all the way out to the edge of the bleed area, and I was told that was incorrect. And I'm like, okay. So I'm going to have to seek out someone who's done this before to find out what I'm doing wrong, because I only see 3 guidelines. I see the white area, which is what I assumed was wanted, or where I assumed they wanted me to place the image. And then I see the red area on the front and back, which I assumed was the bleed. And in the middle of what I took to be the bleed area, there's kind of a black framing line. I said, well, maybe they want me to drag, but they obviously didn't want me to drag the image off that far. I guess I did both the same. Maybe I can start dragging the front image off the bleed area, and then leave the back image the same. I don't know. I'll eventually figure it out, and you'll eventually be able to get it. Amazon is the print book if you want it.
Yep.
And hopefully it sells enough that it'll kick me into basically writing the second draft of The Man Who Was Sherlock, which is because the main, I'm telling the story of 2 men that are creating a myth, but the central mystery to it was their duel with a master spy that they're charged with running down and capturing, and their failure to do that. And it's kind of set amidst the events of the Golden Jubilee era, which is 1887, when Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 50 years. And England launched, or I should say, Her Majesty's Secret Services launched an idiotic plot. And it was originally conceived of by Sir Edward Jenkinson. And his idea was that he was going to create a fake Irish plot to bomb the Queen. And he thought that by doing this, it would inspire the people of England to adopt a federal system. Because he thought, hey, it would be great if, it would end the troubles if the nationalists from all the other non-English countries could take control of their own local affairs. And Ireland was in the worst shape because the Irish laws were truly abominable. For example, Catholics were not allowed to own property in Ireland. So if you were Catholic, you had to be a tenant farmer. So, of course, this meant that the Catholics just resented the heck out of the English because they weren't allowed to own their own farms in their own country. And so these farms all ended up being owned by either A, Irish Protestants, or B, the English. And one of the realities of, as any landlord will tell you, is that on the whole, renters don't take care of their property. They don't own it. Now, some renters are good. That's not to say that every renter is bad, but on the whole, renters are just, well, it's not mine, so why do I care? And so this is what happened to Ireland. The English spent, told stories of the terrible Irish and how badly they treated their farms. And it's like, well, what did you expect? They weren't allowed to own them. You're talking about a country that's 95% Catholic, and Catholics aren't allowed to own property. That's just a really bad situation to be in. And Jenkinson realized it, but he launched this lame-brained attempt to shoehorn England into accepting a federal system where Ireland, Scotland, and Wales would have local parliaments charged with taking control of their local affairs, and at the Parliament in London would basically deal with international affairs, which was probably a good idea. Unfortunately, before he was able to bring the plot to fruition, the government changed, and Lord Salisbury took over. One of the truly terrible human beings in Earth history. And he decided to go ahead with the plot, but for the exact opposite reason. He thought that, hey, if we can convince England that they tried to kill the Queen, they will approve our massive crackdown in Ireland and our further restriction of, the ability of Catholics to go to church and gather in large groups and anything else, which is how it actually shook out. A fake bomb plot was launched. They even arrested people. A lot of the figures in the case mysteriously died. And ultimately, within a few years, the English press just stopped talking about it because, of course, everyone kind of figured it out. Even though it was an official state secret, everyone kind of figured out, well, there really wasn't a bomb plot. It was just, I don't know what they call it. These days we call it a false flag operation. It was just a ham-fisted, idiotic attempt. And of course, it just kind of the events of that year. There was the Jubilee plot, and that bled into one of the events that is known to history as Bloody Sunday. There's about 8 of them, but there was a riot in the fall of 1887 where a large group of people, Catholics, trade unionists, communists too, Irish, obviously, had protested in London about the English treatment of Ireland and the Irish control laws that had just been passed to crack down in Ireland. And the British met the whole event with military force. They fired into the crowd, and a handful of people died. A lot of people got injured in the ensuing panic. And so for a while it was Bloody Sunday before other things came along other even bloodier Sundays came along to dispossess the original Bloody Sunday of its title. So these events are kind of, and I do make reference to them in the book because the Jubilee plot was one of the things that I envisioned the foreign, and I did in a tribute to Doyle, I did recycle one of my own characters to that story. Because I had in my youth I had written a spy story, and one of the characters is a person that adopts a pseudonym, Peter von Zechely, spelled, and Peter is deliberately spelled P-E-T-R, so that you have a Slavic first name, a Germanic aristocratic affectation, and a Hungarian name at the end, or a name for a Hungarian tribe, actually. And I recycled the character for this story. However, I just couldn't get the story. Again, the story arc just proved to be too big to be done in one book. So there's a second book, and I kind of hope that that the first book being out there now will push me to rewrite The Man Who Was Sherlock, and get it out there for people to read.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I sometimes need inspiration. Like I said, when I got to the end of the third draft of The Strange Case of Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes, I could not look at the material again, because as much as I used to love Holmes, I had just come to really hate the subject matter. By then, I had to get away from it. But now it's time. And again, part of the story is that the character, his name in the book is Charles Joseph Sherlock, the man who becomes Sherlock Holmes. And he's the source of the name, because in history, the real source of the name Sherlock is Arthur Conan Doyle. Everyone wonders where he got the name from, and someone says, well, maybe he got it from a cricket player. And it's like, well, anyone show me where Sherlock comes from? The answer is no one actually can. It's something that Doyle invented. However, he got to that section. And so that becomes a key point in my book is how does the name Sherlock come to be? And that's at one point when Sherlock confronts Watson about there actually not being a Sherlock Holmes. It's like, I'm the only Sherlock there. He asked Watson, do you know how many men there are named Sherlock in the British Empire? And Watson responds, well, at least two. Beyond that, I have no idea. And he says, well, you couldn't actually know. He said, but there's only one. There's just me. And he explains the source of his name and why it's completely unique and why there are no other Sherlocks. And, he thinks at the time, because this is set at the time of the case of Scandal in Bohemia, so it would be 1885 before Sherlock mania is a thing, why there will be no other Sherlocks, just him, because he doesn't understand what's coming in the future, especially when he finally agrees to when Watson convinces him to take on the role of Sherlock Holmes, because the part of a Scandal in Bohemia is I re-envision it as being a British royal scandal, because of course technically there's a Bohemian crown in 1885, but the ruler, the holder of the Bohemian crown is the Habsburg Emperor, because that was they call it the dual monarchy with Austria and Hungary, but technically it's a 7-part monarchy because the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire technically had 7 crowns, one of them being as ruler of Bohemia. So I decided that it was actually related to Prince Albert and one of his indiscretions. So the preferred solution of the Secret Service is to just basically eliminate the real person that is behind Irene Adler and have her killed. And her husband Watson says, I need someone here because if Prince Albert is not able to get a solution to his problem and I can't introduce him to Sherlock Holmes, then they're just going to kill, the woman and probably her husband as well. So I need to give him something to, beg him off the situation. And that's how Sherlock comes to agree to play the role of Sherlock Holmes. But in 1885, he would have no idea what the future held for him. So by the end of the first book, he wants out of the role, and the first book ends, I guess you could say, happily. He doesn't get to go back to being who he was, but at least he gets to get away from being Sherlock. But of course, the reader understands, as the character can't, that he's trapped, that he is going to end up being drawn back in, and he will never get away from being Sherlock Holmes. Right. So that's what the second book is about, is how he gets drawn back in and how he's summoned back to England to take up the role of Sherlock Holmes again. And why on the second occasion, he actually had, it's not enough in the first book, he and Watson are partners and Watson does a lot of the heavy lifting. But in the second book, he does not have that advantage, because in the second book, when he returns to London, Watson is missing and he is on his own. And he actually, for the first time, has to be Sherlock Holmes. So, and the novel, of course, ends with circumstances dictating that Sherlock Holmes has to come back to life, because the scandal that has developed is such a magnitude that the only way to keep the press from digging it up is to give them a much bigger story. And Sherlock Holmes being alive in 1894 would so captivate the press, because at that point in time, Sherlock Holmes is again, in the actual real world chronology, by 1894, Doyle has gone through that big burst of creativity in 1891, 1892, and 1893, and has published the first couple of dozen Holmes stories, or short stories anyway. The first two are kind of short novels, A Study in Scarlet, and The Sign of the Four are short novels. But then between 1891 and 1893, he writes, I think it's like 24, 21, 22, 23 short stories. And that's what really kicks off Sherlock mania. And so Sherlock Holmes coming back to life in 1894 would, if again, we're playing the Sherlock game, so it's real history. In 1894, Sherlock's return to life buries everything else in the press, and all of the other stories that contained dynamite charges for Lord Salisbury are now just naturally being buried. And as much as Holmes resents Lord Salisbury, and this, of course, is apparent if you read Doyle clearly had no love for Lord Salisbury. If you read The Adventure of the Second Stain, which is basically a retelling of the Adventure of the Naval Treaty, but it's written in the early 1900s, I think 1902 or 1903. One of the characters is the Prime Minister of England, whom he doesn't name, but the person if you read the description, he is clearly describing Lord Salisbury. And yet, when Sherlock addresses the Prime Minister, he does not use any of the titles that he should be. None of the honorifics. Does not call him Sir. Does not refer to him as Lord Salisbury. He could have given him a fictional, ducal title, but uses none of the honorifics. He addresses them the same way that two commoners would talk. And yet, at other times, Holmes is always very careful to use honorifics with people, but not with the character of the Prime Minister in The Adventure of the Second Stain. So I always thought that Doyle must have really disliked Lord Salisbury to have basically put him into a story without naming him, and then having Holmes treat him with a curious lack of respect for Holmes. And then, weirdly enough, which also kind of fits in with the way I tell the story, although that's a matter for the epilogue of the second book. The year that Holmes retires, which is going through the stories, Holmes largely retires from the public life in 1906. And because he tells the story of his final adventure with Watson, which is 1906, and then he retires. Which is not to say he doesn't come back out of retirement from time to time after 1906, but his official retirement is 1906, which is, strangely enough, the very year that Parliament basically barred Lord Salisbury from ever returning to power. They passed the Act reforming the House of Lords, which basically stated that to be Prime Minister, you had to be from the House of Commons, and that no person from the House of Lords was allowed to hold the Prime Minister title. Prior to that, you just had to be in Parliament, whether the House of Lords or the House of Commons. If you were in Parliament, you could be Prime Minister or hold any cabinet office. But after that, after 1906, to be in the cabinet, you had to come from the House of Commons. And the year that Lord Salisbury is officially retired, because he can't come back at that point, Holmes finally feels safe to leave public life. So that, again, that's a plot point in the second story, is that part of his agreement at the end of the second story is that he will continue on as Sherlock Holmes because he has to, because he can't threaten Lord Salisbury, or he might end up dead like so many people with the Jubilee plot did. General Moriarty, I think it was Francis X. Moriarty, is the general that was involved in the Jubilee plot. He died under mysterious circumstances. I think he was poisoned. One of the forgers that was involved in the Jubilee plot, that forged a bunch of the letters that framed the Irish politician that had been pushing for autonomy, or kind of a federalized system where Ireland would govern its own local affairs and the English could handle Ireland's international affairs. He was basically framed by a forger who created letters that basically made him seem like a Athenian and a supporter of the sort of terror activities of the late 19th century, when he was a dead set opponent of him. But that the forger committed suicide, I believe, in Madrid, but committed suicide just as the police were there to arrest him. They heard him fire the gun on the other side of the door, and they broke in, and they found a wide open window and the man dead and no suicide note. Which to me always struck me as, well, that clearly looks like someone realized that the Berlin police were onto him, and an assassin was sent to take care of him. But again, everybody involved in the Jubilee case, just either vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. So so that becomes a plot point, in essence, that there's a Lord Salisbury has involved himself in a scandal, and now I just realized never mind. Lord Salisbury is involved in some scandals that will really endanger his position, and the only way for the scandals to be buried is for Sherlock Holmes to come back to life, and for Sherlock to just keep on with the role for the time being, so that Salisbury understands that there are no threats. So ultimately, he's trapped. He can never escape the role. But you know, this is part of the telling of the story. Again, right. Just playing Sayre's Sherlock game.
Right. So that's all very interesting. You've done a lot of reading and thinking about Sherlock Holmes and Watson.
Yeah, like I said, technically I never joined the Baker Street Irregulars, but I was a member of, I can't tell you how many Sherlockian societies. Once I discovered the internet in the 1990s, I went to work for a internet service provider, so I had free internet access, and I was, part of, I was an avid reader of Sherlock Peoria, which ran for years. I think it closed down, 11 or 12 years ago. They were something like 15 or 20 years ago, they did an article on the many wives of John Watson, and it's something that I had never actually thought about before. And clearly, when you read the whole thing, it's clear Doyle never thought about it either. Watson was either married or single, depending on what Doyle needed him to be at the time of the story. Because, for example, he marries Mary Morstan at the time of, I think, 1887 or 1888. But by 1894, she's out of the picture because, when Sherlock at the problem of the empty house, it ends with Sherlock moving back into Baker Street and Watson moving in with him. Why is Watson moving in with Sherlock? He's got a wife. No, he doesn't. His wife's gone. And yet in 1906, when Sherlock retires from public life, when he's telling the story of his final adventure, he says that's one of the stories that is written from Sherlock's point of view. He said, well, Watson never played me false until, this final adventure when he got married. So clearly, the story is not set in 1887 because Sherlock is retiring at the end of it. Sherlock is usually the accepted year of his birth is 1857. And for Watson, it would be pretty much the same because Watson tells the story of taking part in the Battle of Maiwand, which is 1880, and he is fresh out of medical school at the time. So, and in those days, medical school was not something you did after college. It was something you did during college. So at the Battle of Maiwand, he would be no more than 22, 23 tops. So he would have likely have been born somewhere in the 1856 to 1858 range as well. So both Sherlock and Watson are about 50 years old at the time of Watson's marriage in 1906. And it's clearly not Mary Morstan that he's marrying because he married her in 1887. Either they got married, divorced, and married again. So when they at Sherlock Peoria, they clue you in that there's literally 7 different changes. And one of the first ones is if you go back to some of Doyle's unpublished work, there's like an early play where there's a character in the American West named John Watson, and he meets a woman named Lucy Ferrier, and they marry. And it was written before the Sherlock tales. And it's the story of there's Mormon gangsters and gunfights, and it ends with Watson and Lucy Ferrier getting married. And so I included that in The Strange Case of Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes. Again, Doyle being a recycler, he didn't throw the play away, obviously, because we still have it now. But he actually reused the story for A Study in Scarlet. He just removed Dr. John Watson from it and put in somebody else, the killer. So, of course, I have Watson tell the story of why he wrote the story and why he wrote it the way he did when Lucy Ferrier had been married to Watson and not to what's the character? Stangerson, I think, in the Jefferson Hope. Stangerson is the alias. Jefferson Hope is the murderer in the first case, and so he tells the story of the Hope murder case, and then how he comes to graft Lucy Ferrier onto it, and it's his tribute, and so that nobody forgets Lucy Ferrier. And if you read the book, did you actually read it or did you just skim it? I don't know if you actually.
I skimmed. I didn't have time to finish it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
But I will.
Yeah. Anyway,
That's all right.
he says it's his tribute, that Watson says it's my tribute to John Watson and Lucy Ferrier. Because, of course, in the book, the prologue ends with, the narrator telling you, this instance where I'm going to tell you the whole truth, I have to start by telling you a lie. My name is John Watson. And of course, what comes after sort of depends on how you interpret Watson's line. And I also make it clear, as you read the book, that Watson lies. And sometimes I make certain that he's doing it unconsciously, because that's just who he is, and how he's gotten there. And then part of all this, of course, is when you read it at the very, very beginning, when Watson is telling the story of his young days, you can see that the young Watson is a very, very human person. And as he goes through his trials and tribulations in India, you can see the humanity is bled out of him just due to circumstance. And when the narrator encounters the person he refers to as the first John Watson in Bombay, Watson is both a corrupting influence, but also a humanizing influence, because the young John Watson is the young narrator, the one that becomes John Watson, is very. He's the sort of person that you would expect to come from the background that he delineates. That he is his normal human responses to things, his emotional responses are stunted and not natural. And as much as his friendship with John Watson is corrupting in the fact that it teaches him to do things that he probably should not be doing, it also opens up a world of emotion to him that he does not know how to deal with, and it's very troubling for him. And when he gets back to England, he kind of stuffs that down. But over the course of the first book, his relationship with Sherlock changes that again, because Joseph Sherlock in the book is supposed to be a very good person. And he kind of gets derailed, but of course we have to take, again, Doyle, per the Sherlock game, we have to accept that Watson is at least telling us some version of the truth when he tells us that Holmes has developed a cocaine habit. So I deal with why that happens. And so at some point, Sherlock goes off the rails, but in some case, it's his friendship with Sherlock that helps. And it helps humanize him, and he grows more human over the course of the story. And this, of course, again, in the second part of it becomes, as he marries Mary Morstan, in the second part of the story, he even starts to adopt some of the habits that he had, that Sherlock had, that he found annoying when Sherlock was around, but he understands in retrospect. There's a point where he finds Sherlock sitting by the grave of his mother, and he asks him, what are you doing here? And he's like, I like to come here and contemplate my failures. Because, of course, he sees his big failure as his inability to get his mother's dying wish was to be buried with her family, or buried in her family mausoleum, which he failed at. And she is instead buried with the second husband that she was married off to, and she returns to England. And she wished to be married. She wished to be buried as with both of her last names, the last name of her first husband that she elopes with, and of course the second husband. It's her legal last name. But when she's buried, the name Sherlock has vanished, and she's buried with the second husband that she didn't love, and he has failed, and he sees it as one of the great failures in his life. One of the things, again, that he was charged to do, get her buried in the Mycroft family museum, family mausoleum, and he's failed at it. And so for him, standing by her grave, it's a chance for him to contemplate all the things he's done wrong, and try to chart a better course. And Watson, of course, thinks of it as a ridiculous habit. But in book 2, he finds comfort in standing by the grave of his wife and contemplating his own failures. It's just one of the things that he picks up from Holmes, and he understands it. It's like, well, on one hand, it's depressing, but on the other hand, it's also humanizing, because we stop ignoring the black parts of us and start looking at them honestly.
Yeah. I agree.
So again, part of this is Watson learning to become more human after his upbringing, and Holmes feeling the bite of, he refers to Sherlock Holmes as Sherlock refers to Sherlock Holmes as a vampire. There's a part in the introduction of the second book where he says, but of course I was not through with Sherlock Holmes because vampires are notoriously difficult to kill. Because he feels that Sherlock Holmes is kind of feeding off of the real person. But part of this is that that through his goodness, he's actually improving the people that he deals with all the time, primarily Watson and also Lestrade. But when you read the book, you'll understand the Lestrade remarks.
Yeah. Well, you spent quite a lot of time figuring all of
way too much time. I know.
No, I mean you really must have worked at this for a long, long time.
I whenever people do trivia nights,
Yeah.
I had at the Colorado Center for the book, they were doing a fundraiser, and one of the things they were doing was they decided they were going to do a Sherlock Holmes trivia game, and so the person who was running it was one of my friends, and it was Sarah Whalen, and she came to me and said, "Hey, I know that you know this stuff more than anybody else." She said, "I've asked other people for questions, and they give me like 5 or 6." She said, "But I hate Sherlock Holmes, and even I can answer these questions." She said, "I need someone that can actually do this." So I think I sent her 40, and she threw out all the other ones that she had. And the game was, of course, they would just basically pick groups of 10. Each team would get a list of 10 questions out of the 40 I submitted, and they would have to answer them. And she said, "You know what?" She said, "Everybody appreciated it." She said, "Nobody got more than 7 out of 10 correct." She said, "That was the winner. They got 70%." And they all challenged the answers, but you gave me where the answers were to be found, and she said, "You're right." They had to, when they got them wrong, they had to admit they were wrong. Yeah, I tell you, I spent way too much time reading Bering's Gold when I was a kid.
Well, that's really your area of expertise, and it's a good one.
Yeah.
So, I think our time is just about up. So, is there anything else you'd like to conclude with, or?
Well, if people want to find me, of course, the book is on Amazon right now on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited, I believe. They can also visit my website where I'll put announcements for future things up. It's jakartapirate.com. Jakarta as in the former capital of Indonesia, pirate as in aragmimates.com. It's a business I own with my partner Liz, and she's from Jakarta, which is why. And Jakarta Pirate she used to run a music website called Jakarta Pirate. It was for promoting Indonesian music throughout Asia and the Western world. And she held on to the website even after it wasn't financially viable. So when we started a business together, we just decided to use the name because we thought it was something that nobody would ever forget. So we called it Jakarta Pirate Associates, and the website is still jakartapirate.com.
Okay.
And eventually I'll be putting up some of my short stories there. Some of my digital paintings are there that people can look at. So
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed talking to you and listening to you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Very interesting. So,
I was looking over your archives, listening to them. It's like I didn't see a lot of fiction there. It was all very serious authors with very serious books. I think I don't really fit here because I mean I know the subject area, but it's not. I don't view myself as kind of a theologian or even a teller of evangelical tales. I mean, I'm Catholic, and I think that comes through in the writing. But I'm not writing for I've never really been a fan of evangelical fiction. I prefer to write for just general audiences, and like Gene Wolfe, kind of sneak the ideas in within the context of the worldview. So,
right. Well, I think you belong here.
Okay, good.
Okay, you belong to the Catholic Writers Guild, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's the tie-in. We're trying to bring in more Catholic writers, a broader audience. And
I do. I write folklore too, so that's why I'm a member there. Basically, I reimagined Slavic folklore. Another one of my strange areas of expertise. And I've published so far a retelling of Maria Morevna. And I use a character from Slavic oral folklore, the King of the Fish. I got introduced to him by a Polish friend 35 years ago, He graduated BU and was going back to Poland. And this is 88, Poland was still kind of in the Warsaw Bloc. And why would you go? Why would you go back? And he's like, well, and he told me a Polish joke about a young Pole that escapes the Tsar's army, and as he's wandering by Warsaw, catches the King of the Fish, and the King of the Fish offers him any wish that he wants to let him go, and he says, "Fine, I'd like a Mongol horde to be summoned from their homeland to travel to Warsaw, sack it, and then go home." And so the Mongol horde comes across the east and sacks Warsaw and returns home. The King of the Fish said, "Why would you want to sack Warsaw? Wasn't it the capital of your people?" He's like, "Yeah." He said, "But to get to Warsaw, the Mongol horde had to travel across Russia, and to get home, they'll have to go back the same way." And I kind of understood at that point. Poland was his country and not theirs, and he was going to go back and offer his defiance. So that was the first. That was the first of the ones I wrote. I basically turned that into a story called The Prince of Luck, which appeared in a literary magazine like 20 years ago. And then there was The Four Serpents, which was a retelling of a Czech folktale called, or I should say not Czech really, a Western Slavic folktale called Little Floatling. And then there was Maria Morevna, which just appeared in an anthology a year ago, again, and bringing the King of the Fish into it. And the Maria Morevna one is kind of the basis for a book called The Undying, which is a novel told in the form of 5 novellas involving Maria Morevna, her husband Ivan, and then Ilya Muromets, who has a very long life in Russian folklore. So I came up with an idea of how he could come to have that very long life in Russian folklore, because he's supposed to be both one of Vladimir the Great's great knights, and yet somehow he makes it to the 12th century, which kind of tough, because we're talking 100 years there. And my solution was that it's actually his nephew that appears a lot, who looks a great deal like him, enough that people mistake the nephew for his uncle. And the nephew the nephew, not knowing who his uncle is, just sort of accepts it because in humility, because his name is also Ilya, not understanding, of course, he's actually named for Ilya Muromets, because he was born in a small town which is now Perm, but in antiquity, Perm was called Yagashika. And that's where he's born, and he's raised in a place near Vladimir in Russia. So he doesn't understand that he's actually related to Ilya Muromets. But his name is Ilya, and so therefore, when people call him Ilya Muromets, he just accepts it, burying his own his desire to be known under his own name, to accepting, to basically accepting, letting someone else take the credit for his actions. So it's 5 stories. Anyway, the first one is, I'm going to put it up on my website, Maria Morevna, as well as The Four Serpents and The Prince of Luck. Eventually, if The Minstrel of Novgorod gets published, I'll put that up there too. I have it waiting for. I had to submit it to Dragon Gems. They had a 6,000 word limit, and I think I was at like 6,300 words. And the only way I could think of to get under was to cut out the section with St. Nicholas, which I hated doing. But if it goes to book form, the St. Nicholas section goes back in, because St. Nicholas is part of the Sadko tales, and he belongs there. And now I've completely overshot my time. So
that's okay. I enjoyed talking to you. So,
okay, thank you.
So if you publish anything more, going forward, which I'm sure you will, get in touch and we'll do another interview.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. You take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.